time. I will not stop on this table, we'll just proceed. So, let's talk about the ecological ownership of firms, of corporations. So the ecological ownership of enterprises exists throughout history until firms obtained charters with perpetual succession motivated as a means to privatize colonial expansion in the 17th century. Initially, both the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company in the beginning of the 17th century issued time-limited investment interest as was the practice for all other enterprises at that time. And the perpetual property rights were granted in 1606 for the Dutch and to the English in 1609. The common law private European companies in the 17th and 18th century were created by deed of association for a limited time to provide liquidity and perhaps capitalization if continuity was desired and accepted. So after the War of Independence, 1782, the US limited the life of enterprises to 20 years or less to avoid recognition, with the life of banks being as low as 5 years to keep them accountable. So, what is the political attraction of introduction of ecological corporations? Voluntary introduction of ecological corporations can be achieved by offering a lower tax rate for those corporations that created a new class, stakeholder shares. Well, those stakeholder shares can obtain, let's say, 5% of the property rights of the investment shares each year to create a 20-year lifelike balance. Fiduciary investors that are obliged to maximize the short-term return would be obliged to vote for changes in corporate constitutions to create stakeholder shares. Because firms discount future cash flows at their equity discount rate, the tax incentive is not substantial and more taxes raised than lost from tax on stakeholder share dividends. So the attraction of limited life equity. The author Shann Turnbull has founded and co-directed 3 separate enterprises through the attraction of limited life equity for investors. So they were the Saxon Vineyards Limited, established in 1970 to purchase and convert 243 hectares of grazing land near Sydney to a drip irrigation grape producer. 6 documentary films financed by the Australian film underwriters from 1980 to 1983. And as well as Bourbon Cotton Limited, established in 1981 to convert 10,000 hectares of semi-desert on the Bourbon River into an irrigation farm with large water storages and pumpings. So each investment venture was tax deductible. Rights to farm income from 15-year leases were sufficient to attract the funds to purchase the land and finance its development. Equity in the copyright of films was provided for only 7 years, and the compound discounted value of cash after this time becomes inconsequential for high-risk investors. Well, there are also some problems with the contemporary accounting doctrines. So, as all constructed productive assets were out with governments allowing them to become tax deductible from depreciation or amortization allowances, limited life investments are norm except for the ownership of land and corporations. So, reported profits are misleading to commentators because they are reduced by an arbitrary conceptual cost described as depreciation to allow investments to be written off to zero value. At the same time, profits may not exist because the cost of the investment may not have been recovered, and do not indicate when the investors has either recovered the funds put at risk or obtained profits in excess of the incentive. Well, to distinguish excess incentive from other forms of so-called economic rent that are reported by accountants, Shann Turnbull describes them as surplus profits. So what are the problems of corporate tax treatment? Depreciation at 10% halves the taxable profit of business earning 20% on its assets. With the 30% tax rate, the reported after-tax profit becomes a marginal 7%, while in fact the business is obtaining an acceptable 11% internal rate of return. Businesses recover their investments from tax deduction that individuals in many countries cannot obtain for the big assets they own, like their home or automobile. In this way, individual voters are paying the tax not paid by business to recover the cost of their investment. If businesses are allowed to recover the cost of their investment from tax not paid, then they should be required to write off the ownership of their investments by transferring their residual values to voting citizens. And corporations do not vote, so they buy the votes of the politicians. Okay, so what are the 7 deadly sins of existing corporations? So, corporations introduce 7 deadly sins to capitalism. They can be inefficient by not distributing all their surplus profits to allow their managers rather than market forces allocate their investment funds, yet be allowed to grow too big to be allowed to fail. Inequitable by overpaying investors with surplus profits not reported by accountants and not understood by most of the economists. Exploitive by not sharing surplus profits with their stakeholders on whose contribution they depend for their existence and to make profits. Alienating by not sharing power with employees and other stakeholders. Poorly accountable by acquiring more resources, social and political powers at some levels of government, yet not directly accountable to their stakeholders whose lives they really affect. Corporations are non-transparent, hiding the identity of their ultimate ownership and control with owners voting on a plutocratic basis that provide the wealthy with the most votes. And degrading for democracy by their influence over the political process and by providing government services. So here is a table that describes the difference between the existing and the ecological corporations. So as you see, there are 8 features that were stated by Shann Turnbull. And so, the right to exist. The existing corporations have perpetual right to exist, and the ecological corporations proposed by Mr. Turnbull are limited to 20 years like patents. So the type of ownership, the existing corporations are static and monopoly, and the proposed ecological corporations can be dynamic and co-owned. So the owners of existing corporations are located anywhere, and the ecological corporations will be mainly owned by the local communities. So the creation of corporation is made contemporarily by the entrepreneurs and investors, and the ecological corporations can be created with the entrepreneurs, investors, and mature African corporations. So the size is also very important because really today existing corporations have no limit to growing, and the ecological corporations would be limited by investors' short-term return off and on investment. So the number of the existing corporation is as at present, and if we had ecological corporations, we would have much more of them because they would be smaller, but that would be a much greater number of them. So the existing corporations are governed mainly by stakeholders in theory, but in practice by the directors of the corporations. And the ecological corporations could be competitively and dynamically governed and determined by the stakeholders. And the regulation also. So today's existing corporations are regulated by the government, and